Thank you, Peggy. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I love speaking to Rotary clubs. My dad is in his 54th year with the Rotary Club down in Waterloo, Iowa. So I myself have very fond memories of Dad coming home after his Monday noon meetings and telling stories of that day's meeting and the speaker that was there. So hopefully I can impart a few good memories for you folks. I didn't see the Waterloo banner back here, so I'll have to get on my dad about that.
We'd love to have it somewhere. That's right.
Anyway, the book that Peggy alluded to is my second book, and it's all Twins history at Metropolitan Stadium. It's called The Twins at the Met. Prior to this, I did do a book on North Stars history, Minnesota North Stars history and memories with Lou Nanny. And the driving force behind these books was quite simple. It was my passion for North Stars hockey at Met Center and Twins baseball at Metropolitan Stadium. I've lived in Bloomington for nearly 30 years, but I have wonderful memories going back to 9 years old in 1970, coming up to my first Twins game at the Met, and 1 year later coming up to my first North Stars game at Met Center. And from that point on, each summer, each Christmas vacation, I was always cross-referencing the Twins and North Stars schedule against my school schedule, and when will the team be home, and when can I have an opportunity to really badger my parents to come on up and go to a game. And fortunately, my folks really enjoyed the scene out at Metropolitan Stadium, and it was a real easy sell for them to kind of wrap that into a family vacation. And they had some very good friends that lived in Minnetonka, so we could come on up and visit the Hamiltons and then see a ball game, but after a while I would really impress upon them, let's cut the Hamiltons out of the visit and just spend our time out around Metropolitan Stadium at the Thunderbird and the Marriott and make more of a weekend out of it. So it was those wonderful memories that I had that drove the passion to create these books. I had been the stay-home dad for about 10 years, starting in 1994. That's when I had the first vision of doing a book to preserve the memories of the Minnesota North Stars after the team had left. And the team meant so much to me growing up as a fan, and when I moved up here after graduating from the University of Iowa in the mid-'80s, I got a job right away with the North Stars and got to know Lou Nanny real well. So suddenly a team that I loved rooting for was now my employer, and it was based on the knowledge there that over those years in the 90s when I was a stay-home dad, I just felt bad that with the team having moved to Dallas, there was really nothing in book form to preserve those memories and for all us North Star orphans to have to remember those great teams and those great players and those years out at Met Center. So once my daughters were old enough that I was going to be able to get back into some kind of working situation, after keeping this idea to myself for so many years, I finally verbalized it to my wife, and she saw the passion I had before with that. She saw the passion I was going to put into this, and she was very supportive in helping me along and kind of green lighting that decision. So nothing goes on like that without the support of a good woman. So I am happy to say that Donna was very supportive of that, because we finance these books completely ourselves through a home loan. I found a publisher in Edina, a wonderful old gentleman named Milt Adams, who mentors first-time authors, because I had my vision for the books, but I had no idea how you go about putting a book together. So I sought out Milt Adams. Milt was able to mentor me on the bookmaking process, with the catch that I had to finance the project completely myself. So with that home loan and Donna's support, I moved forward with that project. I'm still sleeping on the couch, but nevertheless, she's very supportive. It was after the fun I had putting that North Stars book together that I knew I immediately wanted to go in to this project to preserve the memories of Metropolitan Stadium. And I approached the Twins with this idea. The Twins president, Dave St. Peter, is a friend of mine. Dave was a college intern from University of North Dakota in the 80s when I was working in the North Stars front office. So I've known Dave a long time. And I approached Dave and the Twins with this idea of preserving the memories of Metropolitan Stadium and those great players and teams out there. And I said to Dave, what I need is access to all of your old photos and help in setting up the interviews of the gentlemen that I wanted to participate in the book. With the North Stars book, I just focused on Lou Nanny because Lou could tell all the North Star stories. But with this Twins book, I wanted to talk to a wide variety of the players and personalities that were out at Metropolitan Stadium. And I told Dave that I would finance this. I wasn't looking for poll ad money, but in exchange for complete access to the photos and help in bringing about my interviews, that I would donate proceeds of the book to the Twins Community Fund, which is their charity arm. And Dave, having seen the North Stars book that I'd put out, he knew the type of product that I was going to do. Dave signed off on that immediately. So I was off and running and going through the North Stars old, or the Twins old photo files with a fine-tooth comb and just coming up with wonderful old images dating back to 1961 when the Washington Senators became the Twins. And that's the part of the process that I love the most. I love old photos, and both of my books are very photo-driven. And on top of hundreds and hundreds of photos that I gathered for the book, I was going to employ a very unique and different interview process with the gentleman that I sat down with. I was able to have one-on-one interviews with Harmon Killebrew, Rod Carew, Tony Oliva, Burt Blyleven, Frank Quillisi, Roy Smalley, Tom Kelly, Jim Kaat, Paul Molitor, Kent Herbeck, 16 in all. And I figured all of these wonderful gentlemen have probably been interviewed so many times, especially Hall of Famers like Rod and Burt and Harmon, and they get asked the same questions. And what I wanted to do was dig deeper and get stories from them that maybe they haven't ever told, stories that maybe they'd long forgotten. And with me being such a big believer in the power of photos to evoke memories, that's how I was going to conduct these interviews. So I gathered all of these wonderful photos and kind of broke them down into different categories that I was going to use as chapters for the book. Things that were really unique and special to Metropolitan Stadium and all of us who loved going out there. And then when I had my one-on-one interviews with these guys, I just bombarded them with the photos of these different things and just had a tape recorder rolling. And instead of just asking them questions, I just laid out all these photos and asked them just to start reminiscing, and I just recorded all of their memories as they came pouring out. And I broke these down in, as I said, different categories, like the parking lot, because that, when you went to the Met, that's where it all started for you. You didn't just arrive and go right into the ballpark. You got there early because the parking lot scene was so much fun with all the tailgating and the campers' weekends and things like that that went on. And Jim Kaat always remarked about how much fun it was when he would get to the ballpark a couple hours early before the game, and as he would come down Cedar Avenue and got closer, he would see all the plumes of smoke from the grills of people that were there hours before the game started and had their tailgate parties set up. And Rod Carew said the same thing, and how they would park their cars. And Rod said, I'd often be walking into the stadium after parking my car, and people that were tailgating would yell at me and say hi and invite me over to their tailgates after the game, because people would fire up those grills after the game as well. And Rod said oftentimes that they would do that, especially on a Sunday afternoon when they had all night and a whole day before the next ball game. Rod says, I would love to drop by some of those tailgate parties and have a bratwurst and a cold can of Ham's beer with the people. The type of things that ball players would never do today. You know, you tell these stories to young people and they just kind of scratch their head and think, no, that couldn't happen. Those ball players wouldn't sit and have beers with the fans, but they did, and that's some of the things that were just so special about Metropolitan Stadium. For us youngsters, when we wanted to get autographs, we didn't have to stand in a long line like kids today at Twins Fest and pay money. There was that red door right on the side of the stadium facing Cedar Avenue, which had the classic Twins logo and it said Stadium Club. That was the door where the players came out after the games, and all we had to do was hang around that door, because one by one the players would come out, and there was no security, there was no cops, there was no rope line or fence or anything like that. We had complete access to these ball players to approach them and to talk to them and get their autographs. And sometimes you'd have to stand in a bit of a mob, and you'd have to decide, do I want to stand in this mob and get Rod Carew's autograph? And then maybe you'd see another player walk by who was a little lesser known, and you'd maybe break away from the pack to go over and grab an autograph from Wab Wilfong or Luis Gomez or someone like that. And as I would put the photos out for these guys to look at that, they all commented themselves on how much it meant to them, how special it was for them to make the connection with the fans like that. Jim Kaat was one of the Washington Senators who came over in '61 and became an original Minnesota Twin. And Jim made the remark that up until that point, the upper Midwest didn't have Major League Baseball. About the closest there was the old Milwaukee Braves. But there was really nothing for folks from Iowa and upstate Minnesota, the Dakotas, southern Canada, places like that, Wyoming, Montana. He said people would come from all over because this was their first taste of big league baseball. And Jim said, as players, we really embraced the opportunity to connect with these fans and to make these people Twins fans right away. And if that meant standing out in that parking lot for a good stretch of time after a game, they were happy to do that. And Harmon Killebrew said something that I just love to hear. Harmon said, a lot of times I'd come out after a Saturday afternoon game when there'd be a lot more kids there, and I would see just hundreds of kids waiting to get autographs. And he said, it never made me feel bad that it was going to delay my returning home. He said, just the opposite. When I saw that, I got so happy that here are hundreds of kids on a sunny summer day. Anything that they could do, they decided to come to a ball game. And so I just felt good about going out and signing autographs until each kid had one, because I wanted to reward them for coming to the game. So for us to get those autographs, it was so much fun, and to hear these guys talk about how much it meant to them just really makes it all worthwhile. Another topic that I wanted them to talk about was weather-related stories. You know, the ballparks are so high-tech now. Just like last week, Target Field can take on a couple inches of rain in the afternoon. It's not going to delay the game at all. The drainage systems and things are so high-tech, games seldom get rained out. A little different back in the day when it was just an old mud track out there shared by the Kicks and the Vikings, and a lot of fun weather photos that I had of the grounds crew battling the wind and the rain to pull the tarp onto the field, and Bob Allison watching the grounds crew shovel snow off of the field to get ready for the '64 home opener. And as Bert Blyleven was looking at all these photos, he had a memory that came back to mind. Bert said it was the summer of 1976, middle of the season. This was when Bert was traded from the Twins in the middle of the season down to the Texas Rangers. Bert went to the Rangers along with Danny Thompson, our shortstop, most notably in exchange for Roy Smalley and Mike Cubbage. But Bert said about 2 weeks after that trade, the Rangers are scheduled to come play the Twins at Metropolitan Stadium. So Bert says, after all my years as a Twin, suddenly now I'm back at the Met, but I'm in the visitors' dugout on the third base side. He said one of the games was being held up by rain. It hadn't started yet. And Bert says, I'm in the dugout with about 5 or 6 of my Texas teammates when I get an idea. Bert said from his time with the Twins, he knew the number of the telephone in the Twins dugout, the phone that the manager would use to call out to the bullpen or up to the press box. So Bert says, I gather some of my teammates down, I call over to the Twins dugout. Bert says the crew chief of the umpires that series was Lou DeMuro. So when the phone was answered in the Twins dugout, he says, I said, this is Lou DeMuro, and the game's been postponed, and he hangs up. Bert says, we sat and laughed and watched as the Twins players in the dugout and the bat boys start gathering up all the gear and the pine tar rags and the donuts and helmets, and they clear everything out of the dugout, and the players start heading up into the clubhouse. Bert says, I find out later that these guys get up into the locker room where the rest of the team was sitting out the rain and announced that the umpires just called down to the dugout and said the game's been postponed. So these guys now were all getting showered up and putting on their civvies, getting ready to go home. Well, the Twins manager back then was Gene Mauch, and Bert says Gene Mauch knew better. That call doesn't go down to the dugout. It goes straight to the manager's office where Gene was hanging out. Gene came out, saw that what was doing, and said, you guys get out of the shower, get your uniforms back on. And somebody said, well, Lou DeMuro called the dugout, said the game's been postponed. And Bert says Gene Mauch knew better, with a few choice, colorful words thrown. He said, that wasn't Lou DeMuro making that call. It was that blankety-blank Blyleven. Get your uniforms back on. So they do. Bert says about half hour later, the game was officially postponed. And he said, I did these guys a favor. Thanks to me, they all got home about a half hour earlier because they had already taken a shower. Yeah. In the history of the Twins out at the Met, from 1961 to 1981, there were 252 different ball players, ranging from, you know, the most legendary like Harmon to a little renowned relief pitcher like Al Schroll. I was able to get the publicity shots of all of those players. And what I did was had these digitally scanned and made into a 3x5 print, just a good old-fashioned photo like we all remember. And I put them in an old-fashioned photo album, alphabetically, just like you see there. And at a certain point in my interview, after we've talked about the parking lot and rain delays and the conditions of the field, which are so notorious, and getting stories like that, now the guys are having fun with this process and they're loose and I've gained their trust. What I would do was pull out that photo album and just plop it down. And starting with A, Glenn Adams, all the way down to Z, Jerry Zimmerman, I said, just go through this album and look at these different faces And when you see a face that sparks a memory or a story that comes to mind, kind of like the old psychiatrist exercise of free association, when you see something that comes to mind, just let the stories fly. And it was so much fun just to sit back and have these guys go through and look at all the faces of their old teammates and have so many stories spill out. And time again, a story was preceded by the words, "I've never told this story before," or "I haven't thought of him in 35 years. I just flashed back to this one night in Cleveland," and out would come the stories. And that's what you have in the body of the book are profiles of the different players, and then underneath the comments of that player just based on these guys taking that trip down memory lane, or as I like to say, I almost took them more in a time machine, taking them back to that era. And what I did when my interview was done, I had my little cassette tape. There's a neat old lady in Edina that used to have old-fashioned secretarial service. She would transcribe those for me. And I just did some minor editing and presented the interview, a copy of the interview, back to each of the guys for them to read. I wanted them to read every story that they told me, just in case maybe they told a story that they wish they hadn't. Maybe they told a story that they did not want me to consider for the book. I wanted to give them the opportunity to edit out anything that they did not want me to consider. I wanted the book to be a celebration and not something with any hard feelings. So this process came into play when I was interviewing Rod Carew. And it was so much fun to interview all these guys, but Rodney in particular was very slow and meticulous in going through those photos, and he had so much to say about all of his teammates. Some good and maybe not so good. If there was a certain player that he felt didn't reach his potential, Rod would lay it out in very specific baseball terms. But Rod was going through these photos and he got to the picture of a relief pitcher we had for 1 year in 1972 named Dave LaRoche. A lefty, he was only here with us one season. Rod gets to this picture and he pauses and this sour look comes over his face. And he says, "Dave LaRoche," and he shakes his head. He says, "I've never told this story before, but I got in a fight with Dave LaRoche in the locker room in Oakland one night." So I'm sitting back in my chair and I'm thinking, oh, I'm getting a scoop, a never before told story of a locker room fight with Rod Carew. This is great. Rod goes on to say, "In all my years of baseball, Dave LaRoche was the most negative teammate I played with." He said, "This guy complained about everything." Rod says, "We were on the road, we were out in Oakland, and we'd been on a little bit of a losing streak, so we decided to have a players-only meeting." He said, "When one of the guys on the team would stand up to say something, LaRoche would cut him off." Rod said this went on and on. Finally, a guy stood up, was making a point. LaRoche cut him off. I couldn't take it anymore. And I said, "Dave, are you going to let the guys finish talking or not?" LaRoche looked at me and said, "No, I'm not. What are you going to do about it?" Rod says, "That was it. I challenged him to a fight." He said, "In the back of the locker room in Oakland, there was a big walk-in closet. I said, 'Dave, you and I, let's go back here right now and settle this.'" Rod says, "I let him walk in first, and I came behind him, turned the light off, slammed the door shut, and then I started wailing away on him." Okay, now I'm thinking, not such a neat story anyway. It's kind of inflammatory toward LaRoche, and it's not a very nice story Rod tells about himself. So knowing what I know about this process to come, I don't get too excited about getting this scoop of a story, thinking Rod will not want this in the book. So I saw Rod a few weeks later when he came back to town and presented him the interview, and he lives out in Southern California. I said, "Rod, take this home, read through this, and if there's anything you want me to withhold from the book, you let me know, and I promise I will not consider it." So he thanked me, and all the guys are very appreciative that I gave them that opportunity. And Rod called about a week later, and he says, "Bob, the interview looks great. You've got my permission to use any story that you'd like." And I thanked him and told him how thrilled I was to be able to spend that time with him. But I said, "Rod, I'm also a little surprised. I was sure you were going to ask me to withhold that story you told me about Dave LaRoche." And Rod said, "No, that son of a bitch, I want it in there." So,
Did you include it?
so it's in there. And they all signed interview release forms. So if LaRoche had a problem with it, he's got to take it up with Rod. All those guys signed them and said, "Yes, Bob gave me the opportunity to overlook the stories," and I gave him the okay. A funny thing that would happen with the process like this is you never knew what face would spark a fun story. And you'd always get great stories about Harmon and great stories about Tonio and those characters like that. But maybe a very little known player might resurrect a fun memory. And this happened when I was interviewing Roy Smalley. Roy, also had a wonderful time going through these photos and giving me a lot of fun material. And as he made his way through, he came to the photo of a kind of journeyman minor league infielder we had in the 1970s named Sam Perlozzo. Now, Sam has gone on to be a third base coach for the Phillies, and he was briefly a manager for the Baltimore Orioles, and now he is a minor league instructor for the Twins. But back in the 70s, Sammy was a shortstop, pretty much a career minor leaguer. And Roy gets to the picture of Sam Perlozzo, and he says, Sammy Perlozzo. He says, my gosh, one of the greatest stories I know in Twins history involves Sammy Perlozzo. He goes, it never gets told. He says, I can't remember the last time I even thought about it until seeing this photo. Roy goes on to say that it was the end of the 1977 baseball season. The Twins are playing the Brewers at Milwaukee, last game of the year. The Twins are out of contention, the Brewers are out of contention, so the game doesn't mean a thing in the standings. It's just two teams playing out the string. The season's over when the game's over. Sammy Perlozzo was a September call-up that year. You know, they allow teams to bring up a handful of guys in September from the minor leagues just to give them a little taste of what it's like to be on the big league club. Well, Sammy had been with the team for a couple weeks but hadn't played. And on this game, the last game of the season, Gene Mauch, the manager, had decided to let Sam play shortstop. Well, also going into that last game of the season in '77, Rod Carew had 99 runs batted in. And up until that point in Rod's career, he had never driven in 100 runs. Roy said Rod didn't say a thing to anybody about going into that game stuck on 99, but Rod says we all knew and Gene Mauch knew how much it would mean to Rod to hit that milestone of 100 RBIs. So Roy says it's the top of the 8th inning. Sam Perlozzo is scheduled to lead off for the Twins, and Rod is hitting right behind him. Roy says, I'm sitting on the end of the bench next to Gene Mauch, and Sam Perlozzo is getting his bat and his helmet ready to go and jumping up into the on-deck circle to get ready to hit when Gene Mauch yells at him and says, Perlozzo, Perlozzo, come here. He says, you go up right now and hit a triple. Do you understand? This at bat. You go hit a triple. Roy says, Sam Perlozzo turned as white as a sheet. He says he's already petrified of Gene Mauch because he's been up for 2 weeks and hasn't played, and now Gene Mauch has just ordered him to go up and hit a triple. He said Perlozzo just kind of mumbled okay and started to walk away almost like in a trance when Gene Mauch told him to get back, and he says, this pitcher from Milwaukee, and it was old Bill Travers, maybe some of you remember that name. He says, this pitcher from Milwaukee, he likes to throw a split finger fastball. And we've noticed right before he goes into his windup, when he grips that split finger, he'll flap his glove open. That first pitch, if he does not flap his glove, he's going to start you with a straight fastball. You go hit that fastball for a triple. Roy says, Perlozzo gets up there, first pitch comes in, he hits a shot into the left field corner, and Perlozzo hustles all the way around to third and gets a triple. Rod comes up next, solid base hit up the middle, Perlozzo scores. Rod finishes 1977 season, the first and only time in his great career that he has 100 runs batted in, all thanks to Perlozzo going up and hitting that triple on demand. Now, I told you how much fun Rod had wading through these photos. The first time I interviewed Rod, we got as far as the M's in the alphabet, Mike Marshall. When our time was up, Rod was gracious enough when he came back to town a short while later to sit down with me and carry on from the M's to the Z's. Well, it was in that interim that I had my interview with Roy Smalley and heard the Perlozzo story. So now on my second sit down with Rod, I'm real anxious to see his reaction when he gets to Perlozzo. And I didn't let on that I had heard this story. And sure enough, Rod makes his way through. He gets to Sammy Perlozzo, and this warm smile comes over his face, and his shoulders just kind of slumped, and his eyes never left the photo. And he just said, last game of the season, 1977, Gene Mauch ordered Sam to hit a triple so maybe I could knock him in and get 100 runs batted in. He says, you know what? He did it. He did it. I still can't believe it. Rod says, after the game, I promised Sammy I'd buy him dinner. And as I look at this picture now, I realize I haven't done that yet. So, I think I better do that. There are a couple pieces of folklore attached to the stadium that for years were the subject of debate. And nowadays, with the internet, information is so much easier to access. So things like this are, debates are easier to settle. But for the longest time, there was debate over a bomb scare. out at Metropolitan Stadium. There was a bomb scare. Well, what happened? Well, nobody really knew for sure. There'd just be all this little scuttlebutt as to this bomb scare that took place. And to kind of go back to what you were referencing a little while earlier about Dinkytown, it did indeed happen. There was a bomb scare out there. It was Saturday night, August 25th, 1970. So here we were right in the middle of a lot of civil rights protests, the Vietnam War protests, a lot of unrest. And this was a period of time where there were bomb scares going around the country quite often. Well, this was a Saturday night. The Twins were playing the Red Sox, a nice night out at the Met. There's a crowd of about 30,000. And I was talking to the Twins' longtime public relations man, Tom Mee, and Tom told me the story that he was up in the press box. It was the middle of the fourth inning, and he receives a call from the Bloomington Police Department. They call Tom and tell him that they have just received a call at the police station. Somebody had just called them at the police station in Bloomington and claimed that that morning they went out to the Met and planted a bomb someplace, and that bomb is going to go off at some point later in the game. So Tom said to the police, "We've never been faced with anything like this before. We're not prepared. What do you want us to do?" The Bloomington police said much the same thing. They had not been prepared for anything like that. So the decision was made, obviously, to get the people out of the stadium as quickly as possible so they could check for a bomb. But to do so by ordinary means, such as a game ending and everyone making their way out to the parking lot, that would take too long. So the police had told Tom, you need to instruct the crowd that everybody in the upper deck should leave through those switchback ramps that were on the exterior of the stadium and out into the parking lot. And everybody in the lower level make their way down the stairs and onto the field. So it was put to Bob Casey, the Twins' longtime public address announcer, to convey this to the crowd. And when I interviewed Tom, and Tony Oliva, and Jim Rance, and Frank Quillisi, all of which who were there, separately in my interviews, they all had the exact same memory of how Bob Casey got on the public address and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience, but we've received a call, and somewhere in the stadium is a bomb!" and screams the word bomb. So the folks are leaving, going out the parking lot. Folks are moving down onto the field. And Frank Quillisi said he was standing by the edge of the Twins' dugout because there was a stairwell that went right onto the field. And Frank was watching as people were making their way down. And he said, suddenly a woman on her way down just went into a complete panic. And she threw herself down on the concrete of the box seat area, and she wrapped her arms around a wrought iron leg of a box seat, and she was not moving. And her husband is standing above her and imploring her to get going, and he's not getting through to her. And now the husband is worried about his wife. He's worried about the thought of the bomb going off, and they're holding up the long line of people coming on down to the field. So Frank Quillisi says, I looked up at the man and I said, knock her out! Knock her out and drag her away! Getting hit by you won't be as bad as that bomb. So Frank says, sure enough, the man reared back and boom, nailed his wife across the chops. So she throws her arms open in shock, and the husband and another gentleman are able to pick her up as she's kicking and screaming and carry her down onto the field and get her into the dugout. Well, the Bloomington police come out with 2 dogs. And according to Tom Mee, they spent no more than a half an hour walking these 2 dogs through the stadium before they decided, all clear, on with the game. Tom said the entire delay lasted no more than 45 minutes. And you talk about how things have changed. A bomb scare comes down to Target Field. I hate to think of what's going to happen. Black helicopters and everything like that. But only 45 minutes went by, and Jim Rance said, what was funny is I was out in the field and we looked back toward the stadium and there was only one person in the stadium. It was Bob Casey, the public address guy. He didn't leave. Tony Oliva laughed in his funny Cuban dialect and said, those people that went back in, he says, they're crazy. He said, I don't care if there's a bomb or not. If somebody even says bomb, I go home. I'll come back to the game the next day. But when I told this story to the Bloomington chief of police, the current chief of police, a gentleman named Jeff Potts, he said, yeah, that story has been floating around the Bloomington Police Department for many, many years. And he says, Bob, I'll let you in on a secret. Those were not bomb-sniffing dogs. He didn't tell me how. He didn't tell me how they knew, but he said when that call came in, we knew it was a hoax. But once that call came in and we had to go ahead and tell the people at the Met, he said we had to show that we were going through our due diligence to check for that bomb. he said what wound up happening is one of the members of the police force lived right across Cedar Avenue from the Met, and he had a couple dogs. He said, so we just gave a call to old Art Perkins and said, can you take your dogs over to the Met and walk around and make it seem like you're checking for bombs? So you guys got a little scoop here, and you good folks watching at home, but I could tell stories. I see my time is running short. I could tell them all afternoon, but just great memories out there. It all ended for the Twins at the Met on September 30th, 1981. That was the final game out there. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late September, so kids were in school. It was a rainy day, so that's also going to keep the crowd down. And there had been a players' strike earlier that season that wiped out the months of June and July and into August. So interest in baseball at that time was pretty low. So that last game at the Met had none of the pomp and circumstance that they had when they closed down the Metrodome. 15,900 are all that were there. The Twins lost 5-2 to the Kansas City Royals in a game that meant nothing in the standings. The final at bat was Roy Smalley, and in the final at bat at the Met in the bottom of the ninth with 2 out, Roy flew out to short left field. So with that quiet out and that quiet game before that quiet crowd came the end of the era of the Twins at the Met.